Okay, so moving right along here, we're going to take a look at our case study now, an example of some topical reading. And Agatha Christie, who we've been studying all quarter, this will be our last short story from her to kind of wrap up some up here. Now, between the required readings for class and your paper, you've done a lot of reading of Hercule Poirot. We are going to watch a film for Lesson 8 with Hercule Poirot, but this will be our last story. But something really interesting Agatha Christie did is she wrote this collection called The Labors of Hercules, and she took 12 Hercule stories and combined them together, synthesized them, if you will, into one collected set of stories. And so that's why they make such a great case study for some topical reading. And here's a scene from the film version, the television show, The Labors of Hercules, where that show actually combined several of the stories into one. So I don't know if this is Dr. Oldfield here on the bench next to Hercule, but he certainly looks as distressed as Dr. Oldfield is in the story, which is something we'll talk about in just a minute. So some topical reading is finding connections between two or more texts. What Agatha Christie does in this collected set called The Labors of Hercules is she makes an explicit connection between Hercule Poirot, who we've been studying all quarter, and the man, the myth, the legend from Greek mythology, Hercules. They seem very different, right? That's what makes for such a great case study here. But Agatha Christie invented this character long before she wrote the short story collection, The Labors of Hercules, about 30 years, and so, or 20 years, or something like that. So she had something in mind when she chose the name Hercule for Hercule Poirot. It's clearly an allusion to Hercules. And readers for a long time wondered, why is this short, well-dressed Belgian man, why is he compared to the mighty warrior from Greek legend Hercules? Why does he have this name Hercule? Well, this story answers that question. This collection of stories does. And so by bringing Hercule and Hercules together, Agatha Christie gives us just this great example. That's a perfect example for understanding some topical reading better. And so let's take a look at what she did. There's two things I asked you to read for this part of the lesson. One is what we call like the preface, the initial story that's not really a story, but just Poirot's decision to take on 12 cases before he retires and what he wants the theme of those cases to be. This first little preface is just kind of explaining that, how he arrived at that decision. And then the other stories, I just asked you to read one, which is the Lernaean Hydra, but you can choose to read another one if you want. That's one of the options for your discussion board. But let's see in this preface, what does Poirot say that gives us a clue to the connection between him and Hercules? He looked at himself in the glass, so the mirror. Here then was a modern Hercules, very distinct from that unpleasant sketch of a naked figure with bulging muscles brandishing a club. Instead, a small, compact figure, attired in correct urban wear with a mustache, such a mustache as Hercules never dreamed of cultivating, a mustache magnificent, yet sophisticated. Yet there was between Hercule Poirot and the Hercules of classic lore one point of resemblance. Both of them undoubtedly had been instrumental in ridding the world of certain pest. Each of them could be described as a benefactor to the society he lived in. So Hercules, from Greek mythology, fought these ancient beasts, like the Symphalean birds, and in the case of our story, the Lernaean Hydra, the Erathmian boar, the Arcadian deer, lots of different ones. And these monsters were monsters or pests. They were like dangerous or harming society in some way. And Hercule Poirot has spent his career tracking down and capturing murderers. And so he does it with his intellect, his skills of observation, his understanding of human nature, rather than his muscles and his might and his weapons, but they're both essentially doing the same thing. They're both doing something, ridding society of an evil, and the riddance of that evil benefits society. But the societies and the evils are different because they lived in different time periods. So the heroes must look differently and wield different weapons, but they achieve similar goals. So already we have this syntopical connection between Hercule and Hercules. But let's explore it more in a specific story. So I picked the Learning Hydra of the 12 stories because I thought it had the most, well, not the most, but one of the most poignant or important messages, although many of them have really good messages. And that's why I hope at least some of you will be choosing different ones to write on for your discussion board posts, even though I can understand if you're starting to have Hercule fatigue at this point. But let's first start by looking at the original myth, the Lernaean Hydra from Greek mythology, and then seeing what the connections are to the story. Like, what does this Hydra from Greek mythology have in common with the villain Poirot is tracking down? So here are some 4 key points about the myth from Greek mythology. Each time Hercules cuts off one head of the Hydra, 2 grow back. This represents hopelessness for anyone but the hero. If 2 grow back, you'll never be able to get rid of all the heads. No one is fast enough. So that equals hopelessness, which is an important theme in our story, as you'll see in a minute. Except for the hero. So there's something about Hercules that's unique, singular. He's the only person like him, which is another thing he has in common with Hercule. So even though we don't know how he's going to defeat the Lernaean Hydra, because 2 heads grow back each time he only cuts one off, we know that he's been chosen by the gods for these labors of Hercules because only he can do it. So the trick is you have to find the right head. To defeat the Hydra, you have to find the original head, the first head, before it grew these other ones, and cut off that head. If you do that, then you'll defeat the Hydra. So that's what Hercules has to figure out how to do. How does he do it? He needs help. His nephew, Iolaus, helps him. So working together, after Hercules cuts off a head, Iolaus cauterizes or singes the top of the neck, the stump, before the head grows back with a firebrand, a torch. So that way Hercules knows which heads he's cut off. And by these markings, he can eventually narrow it down and find the right one. Which, if you read this story for your homework, Poirot does. He eventually figures out a method to narrow down and find the right head. And he does it with help, just like Hercules does. So we've got as our themes hopelessness, the need to find the original or the correct head, and then having help from someone else to do that. Let's see how those themes show up in the short story, The Lernaean Hydra by Agatha Christie. Hopelessness is a huge, important part of the story. The man, Dr. Olderfield, who hires Poirot, describes what has happened. His wife has died about a year ago. He wants to marry someone else now, but the town is gossiping. The town is saying that he killed his wife, even though he claims he did not. And so Poirot asks him what the effect of that is, of that gossip. What is the result of the gossip? The result is the same thing Hercules facing when fighting the Hydra, hopelessness. Dr. Oldfield describes it as, "My practice is falling off. Wherever I go, I am conscious of lowered voices, of unfriendly eyes that watch me whilst malicious tongues whisper their deadly poison." So he equates people talking about him behind his back and speaking things that aren't true to deadly poison, like the venom of the Hydra. Hydra is basically a more mythological, monstrous version of a snake. And in the myth from Greek mythology, it talks about how the waters in the surrounding area near the Hydra were poisonous. So Christie's very intentionally making these connections. Now, the connections are somewhat obvious. I should note that because she directly and explicitly uses words like poison, so they shouldn't be too hard to find. So the question isn't what are the connections, but why? Why is she comparing gossip to a venomous snake or monstrous venomous hydra? That will be an interesting and important answer, and it's one of the questions you can answer in the discussion board. I don't want to say everything I think because I don't want to influence your perspective too much, but I will talk about it some before we wrap up this part of the lecture. So when you go and do some topical reading and do your research for your paper and make connections, it'll be a little bit harder than this. It won't be as obvious, but hopefully the obvious example will train you in the skill. And what's really important is you can ask why here. Why is it important to see a connection between gossip and between a snake? Why? Because if you answer that question, you'll see how research, since topical reading, making connections between things is important in general. And you'll start to ask that question of the things you're reading. And that can help you have a really productive thesis statement. So hopelessness, because of gossip, is a similar theme between the two texts. What's next? He says, I don't know how to fight this, which is similar to the myth. It means there's something singular, unique about Poirot. Only he can solve it because the doctor says, I don't know how to fight this. Just like Hercules is the only one who can face off against the monsters in the labors of Hercules from Greek mythology. He calls the gossip the vile network of lies and suspicion. Gossip resembles the hydra because each time you cut off one head, two grow back. So in other words, if people are talking about you behind your back, that will spread and more people will be doing it, and there's no way to really contain that. So the snake, in the way it grows its head back and the way it hurts people with its venom, resembles gossip in the way gossip hurts people with its venom. Metaphorical but similar. And it's also impossible to snuff out. Once a rumor starts, how do you stop that rumor? It spreads like wildfire. But Poirot, with his detective abilities, can find the original source of the gossip. Who started the rumor? And if you can find that source, you can defeat the evil of the gossip. Just like Hercules can defeat the snake by cutting off the correct head, the original head, the first one, the head the creature had before it grew other heads. So who started the rumor? That's what Poirot commits to finding. So what are some more parallels? We have the hopelessness, how Poirot is the only one who can do it, how gossip is like the snake, but what else haven't we covered yet? Like Hercules, Poirot needs help. Remember, Hercules had the help of his nephew? So in this case, Poirot enlists his valet, his driver, George, who plays the role of Iolaus, or Iolaus, Hercules' nephew here. So just as Iolaus singed each neck, each spot where each stump or each head had been removed, so Hercules would know which ones he'd already cut off and could keep going until there was only one that hadn't been singed. You would need two people to do that, right? Hercules can't cut the heads and singe the stumps at the same time. Poirot is doing all his investigations, but he can't spy on the suspects. He can't be in two places at once, and they might recognize him. But George, being a valet, is a little more inconspicuous. So George can follow Nurse Harrison or anyone Poirot needs him to follow. And so working together, just like Hercules and Iolaus, they can solve the crime, find the solution. Hercules and Hercule are the ones with the special abilities, but Iolaus and George are the ones who can be in two places at once, or rather the second place for the hero, so that they can accomplish the task they need. And sure enough, George sees Nurse Harrison buying the little package of makeup that she will use to try to frame Dr. Oldfield's would-be fiance. And here Poirot gives his explanation of the case and why he believes it will satisfy the second of his 12 labors of Hercules. It's like in the old legend of the Lernaean Hydra. Every time a head was cut off, two heads grew in its place. So, to begin with, the rumors grew and multiplied. But you see, my task, like that of my namesake Hercules, was to reach the original head who had started this rumor. It did not take me long to discover the originator of the story was Nurse Harrison. So, through Poirot's deductions, he's able to tell that something Nurse Harrison said to him was made up. And it was made up in a way to plant the seed in people's minds that Dr. Oldfield and or his girlfriend might be responsible. And so that's why Poirot begins to suspect Nurse Harrison. But he has to flush her out. He has to get her to confess. And he can't do that without George's help. Once George is looking and sees her by the makeup, he sees her framing the fiancé, then Poirot has her. And he's able to say, we know you bought this case recently. We know it wasn't from a year ago. And then she confesses. So his deductive abilities help him determine who is the original head, who is the source of gossip. But only through help can he flush out that source of gossip, or in other words, cut off its head. So I want to end with questions for discussion. What did we learn from this story? Why is it important? We've seen the syntopical connections here. We've seen how it relates to the Greek myth. So we've done syntopical reading. We've brought two texts together. But the question with any syntopical reading is what did we learn? And that's what you should ask after you do your research. You say, what did I learn? What can I add to this? So I'm not really going to answer these questions. I'm just going to talk about them a little. And there's different versions of them on the discussion board. So you can pick one of these if you want for your discussion board response. And so the first is to think about, why Poirot took this case. Dr. Oldfield doesn't seem like a great guy. He's been ready to remarry for a while. But Poirot, I don't think it's that he feels sympathy for him. It's that he believes in the truth. He says, it is the truth that I shall seek out. So no matter what it is, he's going to go up there and find the truth. And so the idea, the concept, the issue of gossip, it really bothers Poirot. That gives us something to think about, because I don't think we see gossip as necessarily a bad thing in our culture. In fact, I think we see it as an inherent part of our culture. And so I think Agatha Christie is giving us something to think about here. Maybe gossip is worse than we think it is. I don't know. What do you think? Next, we could consider, why did Christie choose the legend of the Learning Hydra to represent this, to use the term from the text, vile network of lies and suspicion? That's a way of describing gossip. But a snake, a hydra, with poison and heads that grow back, is another way of describing gossip. Again, this is a really intentional choice on her part. What do you think she's saying about gossip? Finally, we can shift from talking about this specific story to talking about Hercule in general, which I think is a really important question. Why the comparison between Hercule and Hercules? They're very different. They look different. They act different. We've talked about how they, like Poirot himself says in the preface, they have similar goals, similar purposes. They do similar things. But I think there's more to it, and I think there's a question of timing. In Greek mythology, Hercules might have been the right hero for those people in that audience. Why would this man, the little, short, incredibly intelligent, sharply dressed Belgian foreigner with the mustache, why is he the right hero for the 20th century, a time period which you're much more familiar with than the ancient Greeks, and still relevant today? Why is he the right hero for right now, rather than what we think of Hercules, when we think of Hercules from Greek mythology? I'd love to hear what you think of these, but you can, of course, choose any of the questions for the discussion board. I hope this discussion of the Learning Hydra was helpful to understanding some topical reading, because it'll be a great skill for you to learn.